Kale and Kale, Vance rubbed his eyes as the navigation console beeped softly. The Nomad, his small transport vessel, had been cruising on autopilot for the past 6 hours while he reviewed the cargo manifest for the 5th time. Shipping medical supplies to an outpost like Terminus Station wasn't glamorous work, but it paid enough to keep fuel in the tanks and food on his table. Just another 2 days, he muttered to himself, stretching in the pilot's chair. The Nomad wasn't much to look at, a 20-year-old Swift-class transport with patches upon patches and systems that complained more than they cooperated. But it was home. Every dent and scuff told a story from Kale's 15 years exploring the Outer Rim territories, far from the comfortable core worlds and their stifling regulations. He was about to head to his quarters for some much-needed sleep when a faint alert tone caught his attention. Kale frowned, tapping at the communications panel. The sound wasn't one of the Nomad's usual alerts. Computer, identify incoming signal. Signal identified as emergency beacon. Origin, unknown vessel. Distance, approximately 3.2 kilometers, starboard vector. Kale's frown deepened. Emergency beacons weren't uncommon in this part of space. The asteroid fields and magnetic disturbances claimed several ships each year, but he hadn't expected to encounter anyone else along this particular route. He shifted the Nomad's sensors toward the signal's origin. The screen displayed a small craft, barely larger than an escape pod. Its engines were dark, and it appeared to be drifting. Damage was visible along one side, consistent with weapons fire rather than asteroid collision. "Someone's having a worse day than me," Kale said, already calculating the delay this detour would cause. The Terminus delivery wasn't time-sensitive, technically, but any delay meant pushing back his next job. Still, there were codes even jaded Rim pilots live by. He sighed and adjusted course. Computer, set intercept course to emergency beacon. Standard approach protocol. As the Nomad drew closer, Kale prepared himself for what he might find. In his experience, derelict vessels either contained desperate survivors or valuable salvage, occasionally both. He armed himself with a standard-issue sidearm, more from habit than expectation of danger. The rescue craft was unlike any design he recognized. Its hull was composed of a material that seemed to shimmer faintly, even without direct light. The damage was more extensive up close, clear signs of energy weapon impacts along the port side. Computer scanned for life signs. One life form detected. Species, unknown. Life signs, weak but stable. Kale raised an eyebrow. Unknown species? Cross-reference with Colonial Registry. No match found. That was unusual. The Colonial Registry contained biological data for all known sentient species in explored space. An unknown reading meant either a registry error or first contact, Kale whispered, though he immediately dismissed the thought. More likely it was simply a registry error or an unregistered hybrid. After securing the Nomad to the strange craft, Kale donned his encounter suit, a lightweight protective gear with built-in environmental controls, and crossed through the emergency airlock. The atmosphere inside the craft was breathable but thin, suggesting life support systems were failing. The interior was as strange as the exterior, curved walls with patterns that might have been decorative or functional, illuminated by soft, ambient light with no obvious source. Kale moved cautiously toward the life sign reading, sidearm ready but pointed down. He found the survivor in what appeared to be the control center. At first glance, she appeared humanoid. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head with facial features in familiar positions. But as Kale looked more closely, he noticed the differences. Skin that seemed to shift subtly in color like the surface of a soap bubble, with faint, symmetrical patterns along the visible parts of her body. Unusually large eyes with irises that contained swirls of color rather than a single shade, and a frame that seemed too delicate for human proportions, yet radiated a quiet resilience. She was slumped against what might have been a pilot's chair, a gash visible along her temple. Her eyes fluttered open as Kale approached, revealing those remarkable irises, a swirl of violets and blues that seemed almost to move. Kale holstered his weapon and raised his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "I'm here to help," he said, knowing she likely wouldn't understand. My ship. He pointed in the direction of the Nomad. I can take you to safety. The alien woman's expression shifted from wariness to something like recognition. She attempted to speak, producing sounds that Kale's translator couldn't process. A melodic language with tones his human ears struggled to differentiate. After several failed attempts at communication, Kale resorted to gestures, indicating her wound, his ship, and mimicking medical treatment. The woman seemed to understand and nodded weakly. With careful movements, Kale helped her to her feet. She was lighter than he expected, and though she leaned heavily against him, there was a wiry strength in her frame. She clutched something to her chest, a small device or container that she refused to relinquish even when Kale offered to carry it. They had just made it back through the airlock to the Nomad when a violent shudder ran through both vessels. Kale's eyes darted to the external camera feed. The alien craft had begun to break apart, energy discharges crackling across its hull. Computer, emergency disconnect. Now, Kale shouted, pulling the alien woman further into the Nomad's airlock as the docking clamps released. The Nomad pulled away just as the strange craft exploded, the force of the blast sending a surge of debris toward them. The ship rocked violently, and warning lights flashed across the control panel. Damage report, Kale commanded once they were clear. Hull integrity at 92%. Minor breaches in Sector 5 sealed. External heat sink offline. Primary heating system compromised. Environmental controls operating at reduced capacity. Kale cursed under his breath. They weren't in immediate danger, but the loss of the primary heating system was serious. The Nomad's backup systems could maintain life support, but temperature control would be minimal. Even now, he could feel the ambient temperature beginning to drop. The alien woman stood unsteadily beside him, her gaze fixed on the view screen where the remains of her vessel were scattering into the void. Something in her posture, a slight tremor, a tightening of her grip on her mysterious container, conveyed a profound loss. I'm sorry, Kale said, knowing she couldn't understand the words, but hoping the sentiment might translate somehow. She turned to him, those remarkable eyes studying his face, then uttered something in her language, a phrase that sounded like a question. I don't understand, Kale said, then pointed to himself. Kale. He tapped his chest. Kale. The alien woman blinked, then mirrored his gesture, touching delicate fingers to her own chest. Lyra, she said, the word clear despite her accented pronunciation. Lyra, Kale repeated. It was a start. As Kale worked to assess the damage to his ship and plot a course that would keep them safe while he attempted repairs, he became increasingly aware of Lyra's deteriorating condition. The temperature inside the Nomad continued to drop, and though he'd given her an emergency thermal blanket, she was clearly struggling with the cold more severely than he was. Her skin, which had exhibited those subtle color shifts when he first found her, now seemed pale and static. She trembled visibly, and her breathing had become shallow. The wound on her temple, which he'd managed to clean and seal with his basic medical supplies, now stood out starkly against her pallid complexion. Kale checked the environmental controls again, confirming what he already knew. The temperature would continue to drop for at least the next 8 hours until he could complete the necessary repairs. They were currently at 15 degrees Celsius and falling. This isn't good, he muttered, glancing at Lyra. He made his decision quickly. From a storage compartment beneath his bunk, Kale retrieved his emergency thermal sleeping bag, a high-efficiency insulation cocoon designed to maintain body heat in extreme conditions. It was one of the few luxury items he allowed himself, a relic from his early days when jobs had taken him to less hospitable planets. Lyra watched him with those remarkable eyes as he approached her, sleeping bag in hand. She was huddled in the co-pilot's seat, still clutching her mysterious container, her free arm wrapped tightly around herself. Kale unrolled the sleeping bag beside her and gestured for her to get inside. This will keep you warm, he said, mimicking shivering and then comfort. Lyra looked at the sleeping bag, then at Kale, a question in her expression. For you, Kale clarified, pointing at her, and then the bag. After a moment's hesitation, Lyra carefully set her container down and allowed Kale to help her into the sleeping bag. Her skin was alarmingly cold to the touch. Once she was settled, Kale zipped up the thermal lining and watched as the bag began to glow faintly, its auto-warming function activated. "That should help," Kale said, nodding with satisfaction. "I'll see what I can do about fixing the heating system." He turned to head toward the engine compartment when a soft sound from Lyra stopped him. He looked back to find her watching him intently. She pointed at him, then at the noticeable tremor in his own hands, a tremor he'd attributed to the stress of the rescue, but which, he now realized, was partly due to the cold. Lyra said something in her language, the words flowing like water, then patted the space beside her in the sleeping bag. Her meaning was unmistakable. Kale shook his head. "No, that's for you. I'll be fine. I need to fix the ship anyway." Lyra's expression grew more insistent. She repeated her gesture, then reached out and touched Kale's hand. To his surprise, he felt a gentle warmth spread from the point of contact. Not enough to counter the chill of the ship, but noticeable nonetheless. "Did you just—" Kale began, then stopped. The sensation was gone as quickly as it had come, leaving him unsure if he'd imagined it. Lyra spoke again, her tone more urgent, and tugged gently at his hand. She pointed to the sleeping bag, then to both of them, and rubbed her arms in the universal gesture for cold. Kale hesitated. The logical part of his mind acknowledged that sharing body heat made practical sense in their situation, but the idea of sharing such confined space with a being he'd just met, an alien, no less, made him uncomfortable. "Look," he said finally, "I appreciate the offer, but I really need to work on getting the heat back online. You rest, get warm. I'll be fine." He turned again to leave, only to be stopped by another touch from Lyra. This time, when he looked back, her expression had changed. There was something almost pleading in those swirling irises, something that transcended the language barrier. She looked frightened, yes, but there was something else, a need for connection, perhaps, in the face of what she'd just lost. Kale sighed, his resolve weakening. "All right," he conceded, "but just for a little while, until you're properly warmed up. Then I really do need to fix the ship." Awkwardly, he slipped into the sleeping bag beside her, careful to maintain as much personal space as possible within the confined quarters. The thermal lining immediately began to work more efficiently with the addition of his body heat, and Kale had to admit the warmth was welcome. They lay there in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the soft hum of the Nomad's systems and their quiet breathing. Kale was acutely aware of Lyra beside him, the faint, unfamiliar scent of her skin, the slight difference in her body temperature, the occasional brush of her arm against his. Just as Kale was beginning to think he should extract himself and return to work, Lyra shifted beside him. He turned his head to find her watching him intently. Slowly, deliberately, she placed her palm against his chest, directly over his heart. "Hey, what are you—" Kale began, but the words died in his throat. Where Lyra's hand touched him, a soft glow began to emanate, not from the sleeping bag's thermal lining, but from beneath her skin. The patterns he'd noticed earlier became more pronounced, illuminating in sequence like tiny constellations. The light seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, and with each pulse, a wave of warmth spread through his body. More surprising than the physical sensation was the emotional one that accompanied it. Kale felt a sudden rush of something, not quite emotions as he understood them, but impressions, gratitude, relief, fear, loss, all overlapping and intertwining, distinctly alien yet somehow comprehensible. Startled, Kale pulled back, breaking the contact. The glow faded immediately, leaving only the regular illumination of the sleeping bag. Lyra's expression shifted to one of confusion, then something like embarrassment. She withdrew her hand and said something in her melodic language, the tone clearly apologetic. "What was that?" Kale asked, his heart racing. "What did you just do?" Lyra looked at him helplessly, unable to explain. She touched her chest, then his, then made a connecting gesture between them. "You were—" "What, reading me? Communicating?" Kale guessed. Lyra nodded cautiously, apparently understanding his tone, if not his words. She pointed to herself, made a flowing gesture with her hands, then pointed to Kale. You were sharing something with me, Kale interpreted. Energy? Feelings? Lyra nodded more enthusiastically this time, then mimicked sleeping. She placed her hand on her chest, closed her eyes peacefully, then opened them and smiled at Kale, pointing to both of them. It's how your people comfort each other, Kale realized aloud. Or heal, maybe? Lyra seemed to sense his understanding and relaxed visibly. She said something else in her language, soft and musical, then settled back into the sleeping bag, careful now to maintain the distance Kale had established. Kale lay there, processing what had just happened. The alienness of the experience was undeniable, yet there had been something profound in that brief connection, a glimpse into a form of communication far more intimate than words. Before he could contemplate further, the ship's alarm system activated with a shrill warning tone. Proximity alert, the computer announced. Unknown vessel approaching. Current distance, 10 kilometers and closing. Kale immediately moved to exit the sleeping bag, his mind shifting from introspection to survival. Computer, identify vessel. Unable to identify. Configuration does not match known registry. Weapons systems appear to be active. Beside him, Lyra had gone rigid. Her eyes were fixed on a view screen where a dark shape was now visible against the star field. Her reaction told Kale everything he needed to know. They're after you, aren't they? He asked, though he knew she couldn't fully understand. Lyra's response was to clutch her container more tightly and nod, her expression grim. Computer, evasive maneuvers, Kale commanded, fully extricating himself from the sleeping bag. Maximum stealth mode. Redirect all non-essential power to shields and engines. As the Nomad began to move, banking sharply away from the approaching vessel, Kale helped Lyra secure herself in the co-pilot's seat. The pursuing ship was now clearly visible on the view screen, larger than the Nomad, with a sleek, predatory design. Definitely military. Incoming transmission, the computer announced. Kale hesitated, glancing at Lyra. Her expression was a mixture of fear and defiance. Accept transmission, audio only, Kale decided. A cold, precise voice filled the cockpit, speaking in standard. Transport vessel, this is security command. You have recovered an escaped fugitive and stolen property. Prepare to be boarded or face immediate destruction. Lyra tensed beside him, her knuckles white around her container. Though she might not understand the specific words, the threat in the voice was unmistakable. Kale muted the transmission and turned to her. They're saying you're a fugitive, he said slowly, pointing at her and mimicking handcuffs. Criminal, he pointed at her container. They say that's stolen. Understanding dawned in Lyra's eyes, followed by fierce indignation. She shook her head vehemently and spoke rapidly in her language, the melodic tones now sharp with urgency. She pointed to the pursuing ship and drew a finger across her throat, another apparently universal gesture. They're the bad guys, huh? Kale said, a wry smile touching his lips. Yeah, I figured as much. He unmuted the transmission. This is Captain Vance of the Independent Transport Nomad. We've recovered a survivor from a destroyed vessel. By RIM treaty law, I'm obligated to provide assistance regardless of alleged status. I'll be taking this survivor to the nearest colonial outpost where any legal claims can be properly addressed. The response was immediate. Transport Nomad, you are harboring a dangerous fugitive. This is your final warning. Surrender now or be destroyed. Yeah, that's what I thought, Kale muttered, terminating the transmission. He turned to Lyra. Hold on tight. This is going to get rough. He pushed the Nomad's engines beyond their recommended limits, diving toward a nearby asteroid field. It was a dangerous gambit. The Nomad was built for endurance, not maneuverability, but Kale knew these regions better than most. If he could reach the dense section of the field, the larger pursuit vessel would have a harder time following. The first energy blast from the pursuing ship caught the Nomad's aft shield, causing the entire vessel to shudder violently. Warning lights flashed across the console as systems strained under the impact. Shields at 63%, the computer reported dispassionately. Kale swore and executed a sharp turn around a massive asteroid, temporarily blocking the pursuer's line of sight. Computer, what's their weapons range? Estimated weapons range, 8 kilometers. Another blast caught the Nomad's port side, stronger this time. The lights flickered momentarily. Shields at 41%. Hull breach detected in cargo bay. Emergency seals activated. Kale gritted his teeth. They weren't going to make it to the dense part of the field at this rate. The pursuer was faster and better armed. He needed something else, some advantage they weren't expecting. Beside him, Lyra was watching the tactical display with surprising comprehension. Suddenly, she leaned forward and pointed urgently at a specific section of the asteroid field, an area that appeared particularly dense on the sensors. "What is it?" Kale asked, glancing between her and the display. Lyra placed her hand on the screen over the area she'd indicated, then made a sweeping motion across it, followed by an explosion gesture with her hands. "There's something there," Kale guessed. "Something that could help us." Lyra nodded vigorously. Kale hesitated only briefly. His options were limited, and Lyra seemed certain. "All right," he decided, adjusting course. "Let's see what you've got." He pushed the Nomad toward the indicated section, weaving between asteroids as another energy blast grazed their starboard side. The pursuing vessel was gaining on them, its superior engines allowing it to maintain the chase despite the obstacles. As they approached the area Lyra had indicated, Kale saw nothing unusual, just more asteroids, though perhaps clustered more irregularly than in other parts of the field. "I hope you know what you're doing," Kale said, glancing at Lyra. She leaned forward intently, eyes fixed on the view screen. When they reached a specific point, she made a sharp gesture, as if to say stop. Kale cut the engines, letting the Nomad drift. The pursuing vessel was visible now, approaching rapidly from behind. Whatever Lyra had planned, it needed to happen quickly. She closed her eyes and placed both hands on her mysterious container. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the patterns on her skin began to glow faintly, similar to what Kale had witnessed in the sleeping bag, but more intense. The container responded with a soft light of its own, pulsing in rhythm with the markings on Lyra's skin. On the view screen, the nearby asteroids began to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, then with increasing momentum. It was as if they were being drawn together by an invisible force. "Computer, what's happening?" Kale demanded. Gravitational anomaly detected. Local gravity waves increasing in amplitude by 400% and rising. The pursuing vessel had noticed the disturbance as well. It was attempting to alter course, but it was too close, too committed to the chase. The asteroids continued to converge, creating a swirling mass directly in the pursuer's path. The larger ship fired its retro thrusters, trying desperately to slow down, but inertia and the growing gravitational pull made escape impossible. Kale watched in astonishment as the military vessel was caught in the artificial gravity well, pulled inexorably toward the center of the asteroid convergence. The ship's hull crumpled under the pressure long before it reached the center, secondary explosions blooming across its surface as internal systems failed catastrophically. In less than a minute, what had been a deadly threat was reduced to scattered debris, crushed and dispersed among the slowly settling asteroids. Lyra slumped in her seat, the glow fading from her skin. Her breathing was labored, and she looked exhausted, but a faint smile played across her lips as she turned to Kale. You did that?" Kale asked, stunned. "You control the asteroids somehow?" Lyra shook her head weakly and patted her container. She pointed to it, then made a radiating gesture with her fingers, followed by pointing to the asteroids. "The device did it," Kale interpreted. "Some kind of gravity manipulation technology." Lyra nodded, then pointed to herself, indicating her role in activating or controlling it. Kale let out a low whistle. "No wonder they were after you. That kind of tech could." He trailed off, the implications sinking in. A portable device capable of manipulating gravity with that level of precision could be used for incredible good, or as a devastating weapon. Lyra seemed to read his thoughts. She shook her head firmly and placed a hand over her heart, then gestured around at the nomad, and finally to Kale. The message was clear enough. She hadn't used this power against him when she easily could have. "I get it," Kale said quietly. "You're not the bad guy here." He turned his attention back to the ship's status. The encounter had left the nomad in worse shape than before. Several systems were damaged or offline. Their course was now far from any regular shipping lanes, and the primary heating system was still inoperative. The temperature inside the cabin had dropped further, now hovering at 10 degrees Celsius. "Computer, plot course to nearest safe harbor," Kale commanded. "Calculating. Nearest known safe harbor, Meridian Station. Estimated travel time at current capacity, 38 hours. Kale frowned. "Too long. What's our status on the heating system?" "Primary heating system requires physical repair. Damage to external heat sink prevents effective temperature regulation. Current interior temperature, 10 degrees Celsius. Projected temperature in 6 hours, 5 degrees Celsius." Kale looked at Lyra, who had already begun to shiver again now that the adrenaline of their escape was wearing off. The sleeping bag would help, but with the temperature continuing to drop and her apparent sensitivity to cold, it might not be enough. "We need to make repairs," Kale decided. "Computer, identify nearest uninhabited system with viable landing conditions. Scanning. System UX 427 contains an uninhabited planet with breathable atmosphere. Gravitational conditions within acceptable parameters. Surface temperature in equatorial region, 22 degrees Celsius. Estimated travel time, 3 hours. Set course," Kale ordered, then turned to Lyra. "We're going to make a stop to fix the ship. Should be warmer there." Though she couldn't understand his words, Lyra nodded in response to his tone. She looked pale and drawn, the strain of using her device clearly having taken a toll. Without prompting, she reached for Kale's hand and placed it gently on her wrist. Beneath his fingertips, her pulse felt rapid, her skin cooler than before. "First things first," Kale said, helping her back into the thermal sleeping bag. "Let's get you warm again." This time, Kale didn't hesitate to slip into the sleeping bag beside her. Whatever initial discomfort he'd felt had been superseded by practical necessity and, he had to admit, a growing sense of connection with his unusual passenger. As they settled into the shared warmth, Lyra once again placed her hand over Kale's heart. The question in her eyes was clear, asking permission this time. Kale nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "Show me." The patterns on Lyra's skin illuminated once more, and that strange, intimate connection blossomed between them. This time, Kale didn't pull away. Instead, he tried to open himself to the experience, to understand what Lyra was sharing. The impressions came more clearly now. Gratitude for his rescue, fear of her pursuers, exhaustion from using her device, and something deeper, a profound sense of purpose, of responsibility. Images flashed through Kale's mind. A beautiful world with architecture that seemed to grow from the earth itself. Beings like Lyra, their skin adorned with similar patterns, and then violence, explosions, invaders with cold, efficient weapons, the same design as the ship that had pursued them. When the connection faded, Kale found himself breathless, his heart racing. "You're home," he whispered. "They attacked your home." Lyra nodded sadly, tears gathering in her remarkable eyes. She held up her container, then made a gesture encompassing the stars visible through the view screen. "That device," Kale said slowly, "it's important. For your people." He didn't have the words, and she couldn't provide them, but something in her expression, a mixture of hope and determination, told him enough. Whatever was in that container was more than a weapon. It was a lifeline, a future, perhaps the last remnant of her world. "I'll help you," Kale promised, knowing she wouldn't understand the words, but hoping she'd understand the sentiment. "Whatever you need to do, wherever you need to go, I'll help you get there." Lyra studied his face, those swirling irises seeming to peer into his soul, then smiled, a genuine expression of relief and gratitude that transcended language. She said something in her melodic tongue, soft and earnest, then rested her head against his shoulder. As the nomad carried them toward the uninhabited planet, Kale found himself contemplating how quickly life could change. 24 hours ago, he'd been a solitary transport pilot with a simple delivery job. Now he was harboring a refugee with technology powerful enough to crush a military vessel, fleeing from an enemy he knew nothing about, and making promises he wasn't entirely sure he could keep. Yet, despite the danger and uncertainty, there was something about this situation, about Lyra, that felt right. Perhaps it was the simple clarity of knowing who the bad guys were, or perhaps it was the connection they'd formed, brief though it was. Either way, as Lyra slept fitfully against his shoulder, Kale realized he was committed to this course, wherever it might lead. 3 hours later, the Nomad broke through the atmosphere of UX 427, a small terrestrial planet cataloged but never colonized. As promised, the equatorial region was pleasantly warm, a stark contrast to the chilled interior of the ship. Kale guided the vessel to a landing in a clearing surrounded by strange, blue-tinted vegetation that resembled Earth's ferns, but on a larger scale. Once they'd landed, Kale gently woke Lyra, who had remained asleep for most of the journey. She looked better after the rest, some color having returned to her iridescent skin, but still far from recovered. "We're here," Kale said, gesturing to the view screen where the alien landscape was visible. "I need to make repairs. It's warm outside. Should be good for you." Lyra followed his gaze to the view screen and nodded in understanding. She carefully extracted herself from the sleeping bag, still clutching her container close to her chest. Kale gathered his repair tools and emergency kit, then opened the Nomad's exterior hatch. Warm, humid air rushed in, bringing with it unfamiliar scents, something like cinnamon mixed with ozone. The gravity was slightly lower than standard, giving each step a subtle buoyancy. He helped Lyra down the ramp, watching as she took in their surroundings with wide eyes. The blue fern-like plants swayed gently in a breeze, their surfaces occasionally catching the light in a way that suggested a crystalline structure. The sky above was a pale lavender, with UX 427's small sun shining brightly. Lyra closed her eyes and tilted her face toward the sun, a soft sigh escaping her lips. The patterns on her exposed skin, her face, neck, and hands seemed to respond to the natural light, becoming more pronounced and shifting through subtle hues of blue and violet. "Looks like that helps," Kale observed. "You stay here, get some sun. I need to check the damage." He indicated that she should remain in the clearing, then moved around to the exterior of the ship where the heat sink was located. The damage was worse than he'd hoped, but better than he'd feared. The heat sink itself was intact, but the coupling mechanisms had been damaged by debris from either Lyra's exploding vessel or their encounter with the military ship. Kale set to work, occasionally glancing over to check on Lyra. She had settled on a flat rock near the edge of the clearing, her container placed carefully beside her. Her attention seemed divided between watching Kale work and studying the strange vegetation around them. At one point, she approached one of the larger fern-like plants and extended her hand toward it cautiously. To Kale's surprise, the plant seemed to react to her presence, its fronds turning subtly in her direction like a phototropic response, but much faster than any plant should move. "Careful," Kale called out instinctively, though he had no reason to believe the plant was dangerous. Lyra glanced back at him and nodded reassuringly. She placed her palm flat against one of the fronds, and the patterns on her skin illuminated briefly. The plant's frond curled gently around her hand in what almost appeared to be a gesture of affection. When Lyra withdrew her hand, she was smiling, a genuine expression of delight that transformed her features. She turned that smile toward Kale, pointing excitedly at the plant and then to herself, as if to say, "Did you see that? It recognizes me." "Interesting," Kale said, momentarily distracted from his repairs. "Your people have some connection to plant life? Or maybe just life in general?" Lyra couldn't answer directly, of course, but her continued interaction with the plants suggested a natural affinity. As Kale returned to his work, He found himself wondering more about her species, their capabilities, their culture, their world. The glimpses he'd received through their brief connection had only piqued his curiosity. After about an hour of work, Cale had managed to repair the heat sink coupling and was running diagnostics on the system when he heard Lyra call out, not his name, but a sound of alarm that needed no translation. He looked up to see her pointing urgently at the sky. A ship was visible against the lavender backdrop. Not the same vessel that had pursued them earlier, but similar in design. It was still high in the atmosphere, apparently conducting a scan pattern. "They found us," Cale muttered, quickly gathering his tools. "But how?" "We left no trail." Lyra was already moving toward the Nomad, her container clutched tightly to her chest. Her expression was one of grim determination rather than panic. Cale hurried to complete the essential connections. The heating system wasn't fully repaired, but it would have to do. "Computer, prepare for emergency launch," he called out as he worked. "Warning, external panels are open. Heat sink calibration incomplete. Launch not recommended." "Override," Cale commanded, securing the last necessary components and slamming the access panel closed. "Initiate launch sequence." He sprinted back to the boarding ramp where Lyra was waiting. Together they rushed inside as the Nomad's engines began their startup cycle. Through the view screen, they could see the pursuing vessel had altered course, now heading directly for their position. "Computer, time to launch capability." "Engine warm-up, 45 seconds remaining." Cale swore under his breath. It would be close. The pursuing ship was descending rapidly, clearly having spotted the Nomad. "Computer, run interference routines. Deploy countermeasures on my mark." Lyra touched Cale's arm, drawing his attention. She pointed to her container, then to the ship's communication array, making a connecting gesture. "You want to connect your device to my ship?" Cale asked, surprised. "What will that do?" Lyra repeated the gesture more urgently, then pointed to the pursuing vessel and mimicked it changing course, veering away. "It will mislead them somehow." Cale guessed. "Create a false trail?" Lyra nodded vigorously. Cale hesitated only briefly. They had few options, and Lyra's technology had already proven remarkably.